I'm very honoured to be asked by the association in the first place. I'm even more honoured to be on the platform with two speakers who know far more about it than I do. Admiral Heaslip, Sir Nicholas Bonser, and of course Commander Muxworthy. And I was hoping to go at the end so I could pick up a few of their points. But I'm going to have to go first and try not to say anything that are going to tear too many holes in. I had no association on a personal level with the armed forces. I've never served. My father went all through the Second World War. He joined up in 1939. I think he was demobbed in 1946. And the only piece of advice that he gave me in the military career was never volunteer, so I never have. And I'm very grateful to his generation, and of course the generation since who fought to save, to keep our independence and our freedom. And I think most people in UKIP will value that. In fact, all of them will value that tremendously. And in fact, looking through the manifesto of the association, there are many, many parallels between what it asks for and what is actually going to become UKIP policy from the document that Admiral Heaslip and I co-chaired last year, and he did a tremendous amount of work along with the committee. I had the easy task of just pulling it together at the end into a political document. But it was really a pleasure to serve on it, because under Admiral Heaslip's leadership and the distinguished people on there with a great deal of technical knowledge and expertise, we were able to pull something together fairly quickly, which we were all very pleased with. Now, I put my glasses on and then I can actually read my notes. What is UKIP defence policy? And when me and Dick sat down and discussed this, I think the first thing that we agreed is you have to have an idea of what your national interests are before you start to frame a defence policy and arrive at what your defence needs are. And I think that's something that's gone completely out of the window over the last decade or two. What are our national interests? You need to think about that. You need to decide them before you can decide what is an appropriate amount of money to spend. And there's always going to be a contest between all the competing factions in government for money. How much money do you spend in order to create the armed forces that you need in order to protect those national interests? And I think that that's where we've gone drastically wrong over the last few years. We don't really know what our national interests are. We have smaller and smaller armed forces, and yet we're deploying them in more and more ambitious theatres like Afghanistan, like Iran, and who knows what's going to come up next, and they are stretched to absolute breaking point. Now, when you're in the European Union, one of the things you hear quite frequently is, of course, that the European Union has kept the peace in Europe since the end of the Second World War. In fact, I heard it again only this week from Declan Ganley, who is the multi-millionaire who helped fund the No campaign in Ireland recently against the Lisbon Treaty, and he's firmly of this opinion. Of course, if you've got that opinion, it means you don't actually know very much about the history of the last 40 to 50 years. What kept the peace in Europe was, of course, NATO. It was the fact that the European countries in NATO were democracies. And it's almost 100% true, I would say, that democracies do not make war on each other. And the countries that weren't democracies, like Spain and Portugal, became democracies. And that's what really kept the peace. The fact that these countries were independent, sovereign, democratic states were very unlikely to make war on each other, working within an organisation which knew what its priorities and its interests were. Now, the European Union intends to change all that. Occasionally in Brussels I go to meetings and seminars were actually useful. And I've been to a couple over the last year, which were organised by the European Union along with businesses who actually want to sell defence equipment and systems. And they were very illuminating, because what's going to happen over the course of the next few years, if the Lisbon Treaty is successfully ratified, you won't see a European army. At this meeting, one of the audience asked a question, and they said, will there be a European army? One of the MEPs there, Elmar Brok, who is every year writes a report on why there should be a European army, said, yes, but we mustn't speak about it. One of the other speakers, a German interior minister, said, yes, of course there will be in the long term, but if we talk about it, it just upsets NATO and frightens the British. So this is the intentions, but they're not going to be so stupid as to actually say we need a European army and we need billions of funding to pay for it. What they're going to do quite cleverly is amalgamate the existing armed forces of the different countries in Europe. And they'll do that by three or four main means. The first one will be by having a common equipment procurement policy, so that those services become more and more integrated with each other and more difficult for them to operate independently or possibly with the United States. They will have common command and control structures, so that they will be commanded from the top down from organisations in Brussels, and they will have common communication systems. For example, I'm sure you've heard about the Galileo satellite system, which ever since I've been on the Security and Defence Committee since 2004, they kept saying, oh no, it's nothing to do with the military, of course it's not, this is just scaremongering. And of course, eventually, when they couldn't find anybody to fund it on a commercial basis, they had to admit that it actually was for military purposes, and the money would have to come from the taxpayer. And of course, what they're doing is setting up more and more joint operations between the different military capabilities of the European countries, but it's always done in the name of humanitarianism and disaster recovery, and they send troops into places like the Congo or Kosovo or everywhere it is. And of course, it's very difficult to argue with that, because these people are going in there trying to alleviate disastrous situations or provide support for the civil population. But it's being done for a reason. They are breaking these forces in slowly to operating together under the common command control structures, and this is where they want to lead. They won't ask you a budget for the European army until the thing has actually become a de facto fact at some point in the future. And going to these conferences was an eye-opener for me, because I realised one of the things that's driving this process, and it's actually big business. Because what you do is you'll see speakers from the European Union get up and say, we must have this system that means we can monitor every ship in the Mediterranean, we must have border controls and all these kind of things. And then a business will come along that can actually supply those solutions. So you're actually seeing this being driven by money. Big business wants the contracts that will provide the solutions that will enable the European Union to achieve its military capabilities. And I think this is the single most important thing I've learned in the last year or so in understanding why this process is happening and what's actually driving it forward. Now, that's how it's being done. It's being driven by big business, as I say, and of course the ambitions of the European Union to achieve a military capability. One of the questioners on the last conference I went to made a very, very poignant comment. They said, who fears the European Union? Well, of course, nobody very much does, apart unless, of course, you're a taxpayer, then you have good reason to fear it. But what they meant was, if they don't have their own military capability, then they cannot implement their foreign security and defence policy. Now, you all remember, I'm sure, the famous remark that Stalin made in the Second World War, when one of his staff said to him, the Pope is very upset about something or other that Stalin was doing in Europe. And Stalin turned around to his aide and he said, well, tell me, how many divisions does the Pope have? Stalin had a very good way of going to the root of a problem and understanding the key points very quickly and summing it up. And that's what the Europeans think now. Nobody fears them. Nobody's going to take their foreign security policy seriously unless they have a military capability to go